I'm going to show you quickly how to lengthen or shorten your skirt pattern piece. The pattern was drafted for a height of 5'5". If your height falls above or below this, then I recommend that you add or subtract length from your skirt pattern piece. You will be adding or subtracting the exact discrepancy. So for instance, if you are 5'6", you'll be adding 1 inch, and if you are 5'4", you will be subtracting 1 inch. So you can see the length and shorten lines located here on your pattern piece that run horizontally, bisecting your pattern. You have one in the center and one further down the pattern piece. If you are adding or subtracting 2 inches or less, I recommend that you do so at the mid-line, the top length and shorten line that runs along the center of the pattern. If you need to add more than 2 inches, add or subtract more than 2 inches, I recommend that you do so splitting up the discrepancy. For instance, if you are adding 5 inches, add 2.5 inches at the lower length and shorten line and 2.5 inches at the upper line. We are going to begin today by lengthening. I'm going to be adding 2 inches at the lower length and shorten line, and I begin by simply cutting my pattern along that line, dividing my pattern piece into 2 pieces. Now that you have your pattern piece cut into 2 pieces, simply spread them apart, and we will be placing scraps of paper behind the upper pattern piece to create our additional length. Now I like to leave additional scrap of paper hanging off both sides, especially on the curve side. Let me show you. You can see here is where the curve, the drastic curve of the petal curve runs. I like to put an entire sheet of paper over here to allow a lot of space here for grading our 2 pattern pieces back into one another. Okay, so you can see I have my top pattern piece here. I've added additional scrap paper to create the additional length, and now I'm simply going to measure the amount that I wish to add. I am going to be adding 2 inches, so I'm simply going to place my ruler along the top pattern piece, marking 2 inches down, all the way across. And connecting those. Now I also want to carry my grain line down through my scrap of paper to help me line out my pieces. Now you can see the grain line here runs vertically along your pattern. It runs parallel to all the vertical lines that bisect your pattern. So simply place any straight object or ruler along one of the vertical lines and carry that line down through your additional scrap paper. I like to do it on all of my grain lines. Now you will simply take your bottom pattern piece, lining it up with the new line that you've drawn 2 inches below, or however much you're adding, ensuring that you line up your grain line. Now this helps to keep the integrity of the pattern and doesn't change the shape of the curve. So it's imperative that you keep the grain line intact. So now we're going to need to grade our drastic curve back in with one another. Now when we take an up-close look at the curve, the drastic curve of our pattern piece, you can see just how wide the discrepancy is here. We have the lower pattern piece ending here and the upper pattern piece ending here, and we need to blend these 2 back in with one another. So you can see why having such a wide area of scrap paper to work with is beneficial at this time. So I usually begin from the bottom, working my way up, and then begin from the top, working my way down, and I meet in the middle. So I start along the natural edge of the pattern and work my way in just ever so slightly. maintaining the curve of the pattern, simply pulling it in just a bit. I do the same thing from the top. I follow the edge, working my way out, just ever so slightly, mimicking the curve of the pattern. Until we meet in the middle. Now you have all this scrap paper to work with, so once you create your first guideline, if you step back and you're like, you know what, I think this needs to curve just a little bit more, to help blend it back in, you can kind of do some shading to help with that. So what we're essentially doing is adding a little bit of width to the top of the pattern piece and subtracting some from the bottom. Once you have your guideline drawn in, you will simply cut along that guideline, and you will see the nice curve of the pattern. You can always go back in and shave just a little bit away in order and just get it just right. And it's not an exact science, it's more like an art. Just play around with it until you feel comfortable with the curve. We're going to take a look at the other side, which is much easier because it is a straight line. So I take my ruler, or any straight item that you have, I place one corner below and one corner above. You know what? I'm going to need to add a little extra scrap of paper. I need a little bit more room to play with over here. Down here. So I'm going to take one corner below and one corner above and simply draw a straight line between the two. Trim along that line. It's awkward to cut this way. Okay, so I cut a little jagged because I was cutting that way, but you could see the basic idea is that you draw the straight line and cut between the two. Now we are going to subtract some length. You can see the upper lengthen shorten line here. Again, cut along the lengthen shorten line. And rather than adding a scrap of paper to this one, we will simply be subtracting some length. So you will want to measure the amount that you wish to subtract. And I'm going to be taking away 1 inch. So I'm measuring 1 inch down from the bottom pattern piece along the cut line that I just made. And connect those lines. You don't need to carry your grain line through on this one because you're not adding additional scrap. But you do need to pay special attention to line the grain line up. So I'm going to show you that. Okay, so I've drawn my new line in 1 inch below. I simply place my top pattern piece atop the bottom and line up the grain line. You can see here and here I'm lining them up. Now it may feel more intuitive to line up your corners, but if you did that, then the grain would be off and it would be compromising the shape of your pattern. So line up the grain lines along your new length line that you've just drawn in. Secure the pattern back together, and then we will grade the sides back in. Now you will need a small scrap of paper for this. Right here is where I have my discrepancy. The top pattern piece hangs over just a bit. I'm going to tape a piece of paper in there, and we are simply going to grade the two back in. Again, removing a small portion of the top, adding a small portion to the bottom. So I'm going to start here, bringing it in just ever so slightly, adding a little bit to the bottom, grading them back into one another, and then cutting along your guideline to bring the two pieces back together. And the other side, again, right here, adding a slip of paper behind, using your ruler, placing it along the edge of your pattern above and below. Now you do have a little bit of a curve here. This is part of the hip curve. If you are adding 2 inches here, you may wish to curve this line just a bit and not use the straight guideline from your ruler. With subtracting only 1 inch, I can still use the ruler as my guide. Removing a small portion from the bottom and grading it back in. You will also need to add or subtract the same amount of length from the same lengthen shorten lines on the back pattern piece that you did on the front pattern piece. So I hope that you found this tutorial helpful in adding or subtracting length to your Cabo skirt.